I've just realised. I should put that on really, but instead I've got this on, so it's fine. Everyone's just seeing me messing about, making sure it's all going on. But it is all going on, so hello. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. I don't know why I'm still playing the Umpires theme tune. Umpires is long gone, unfortunately. But there you go, it's still there. I need to change that. Welcome back. Welcome to VUX World. I'm Ken Sims, as always. And today we're going to have an epic conversation with Cooper Johnson, who is voice UX designer at Gridspace. And what's really interesting about this conversation that is going to happen is that there is lots of excitement, obviously, around generative AI and AI in general. There are lots of companies that are popping up that claim themselves to be voice AI companies. I won't name names as such, but there are lots of these kind of, I suppose, new startups coming out there that claim to be able to create these supernatural generative AI, voice AI agents, and that's the future, and everything seems to be going, in terms of the hype and attention that these companies are getting, it seems to be sort of, something that people are interested in. However, Gridspace has been around for a long time. It's been doing enterprise voice AI deployments for a long time. And so it's one of those companies that has been there and done it. And so I'm interested in figuring out, what does Gridspace do and how is it serving its clients? What is kind of Gridspace's perspective and Cooper's perspective on voice AI and how generative AI has either changed or impacted or not the voice AI space in the enterprise. So without further ado, please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Cooper Johnson to VUX World. Cooper, welcome, my friend.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for having me. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you again.
2-3 weeks since Unparsed, and I'm still feeling the excitement right at the high. So yeah, very nice to see you again.
Good. It was brilliant to have you there as well. Thank you so much for making the journey. I know that's the second time you've been to Unparsed as well. So you came last year, you're back this year. So yeah, really appreciate you making the effort.
Oh yeah, highlight of my year. My home away from home now, I think, now that we've done 2 of them.
Part of the furniture now.
Yep.
But no, it was great. It was great to have you, and Phoebe did a great job as well. You know, really engaging talks. We had lots of discussions and opportunities to catch up and stuff like that outside of the conference and all that lot. And as I kind of alluded to in the beginning there, Gridspace, I've known about Gridspace for a long time. We've known each other for a little while, and
Right.
it's kind of one of those companies that, you know, as I said, there's companies that have emerged in the last kind of couple of months, maybe a year or so, since the emergence of ChatGPT, that kind of claim to be, you know, the future of voice AI. And I've actually played around with a number of them, because some of them have little demo calls on the website that you can just call and have a conversation with and stuff like that. And obviously my goal when I do that is just to explore it and try and break it. And 9 times out of 10, you can you can break it. And I think it's because a lot of these newer kind of startups are basing everything from end to end on generative AI, which obviously is fallible in many cases, especially if you're trying to execute a business process. So maybe we can begin with, tell us a bit about yourself, a bit about Gridspace, and how Gridspace kind of in its positioning differs from some of the companies that people may have been running into over the last kind of 2 years in this new wave of Gen AI voice agents, so to speak.
Right. I'll start with talking about the company, because I think it's a little more interesting than I am. But Gridspace has been around for about a decade now. We are speech technology powered by machine learning, AI. And the reason we've been around so long is kind of everything we do to this day is still built on our original product, which is a macro level speech analytics platform called SIFT, which can, listen to every conversation that passes through a business or a contact center. It doesn't need to be a large business or a large contact center. Really, anyone who wants to, run quality assurance and gain insights from their calls. So SIFT is the platform that everything runs on, where AI is applied to conversations, and you can look at single transcripts if you want to see what went wrong or what went well in a single call, or do this broad analysis of many calls to see what's going well, what trends are emerging, or perhaps gain some insights into unfolding disasters that customers who are calling into the contact center or the business are experiencing. So that's kind of the foundational technology. But most of what I work with today is our virtual voice agent, Grace. And Grace is now on her 2nd generation. We're into LLM Grace 2.0, as we say it. I'm very lucky to work with her. But before I get too far from the the special nugget of truth about what Gridspace, what differentiates us, is that all of our products, Sift and especially Grace, run on models that were built in-house. So we are not reliant on anyone else's tech. We don't use third-party vendors for any of our LLMs, and there are multiple LLMs that are tasked with very specific responsibilities within our product suite. So Grace runs on multiple LLMs, and it's very nice that we have both the control over what our models do, what they're capable of, and really the reassurance that it wasn't garbage in, garbage out. We know what's in our models, or rather, my very brilliant colleagues who work specifically on the models, kind of as a special ideas lab within the company, know what went into our models. So there's no junk in there. That's very reassuring at the end of the day. And I like knowing that I can tell customers of Gridspace that there's no funny business, no trash in the models, and that I am able to stand behind the Grace experiences that either I build out or that I coach customers through building out themselves. So yeah, we're speech technology and we own our own models. And we're very, very proud of all of that. And I really admire all of my engineering colleagues who make that happen every day.
Nice.
But I'll loop back a little about me. I'm not as impressive as the company. I'm voice.
You say that, but I found on your LinkedIn earlier on that, correct me if I'm wrong, you worked at WWE.
I did very briefly, and I'm still very good friends with the people that I worked there. I actually worked in the film division of WWE. Real quick aside for all the wrestling fans out there, possibly a highlight of working there was I was seated at my desk. So I was at diminished height because I was in a seated position, and Big Show walked by me and asked me where the restroom was.
Wow.
And if you're seated and Big Show walks by you, you feel like a baby. that was the kind of thing that happened in my time at WWE Studios.
Wow. Nice.
But yeah, that cuts to the core of it. Like so many people who work in conversation design, because after all, VUX, voice user experience designer, is an elaborate term for conversation designer at the end of the day. I had kind of an unpredictable career path into this field. No one's majoring at university level in conversation design yet. I think I haven't crossed paths with anyone. So our paths were all very strange, and mine came from the entertainment industry. And specifically, whenever I could in my decade in the entertainment industry, I was working in animation, specifically within that in voiceover production. I was very lucky to work with a lot of really talented voice directors and producers and voice actors in my time in that field. So I have all these internalized lessons about what works in voice and what good practices for speech are, and it's fun to be able to translate certain rules that you pick up about screenwriting, about what makes a fluid scene, and thinking about how those apply to something much more mundane, but also extremely important, like, a business interaction with a lot of business logic, like someone calling Grace who just wants to activate a new credit card or who wants to check on the status of a prescription. So it's very fun to think, what rules of screenwriting and good drama also apply to the conversations that we typically have every day. So that's how I found my way into conversation design, from animation voiceover. And I really love what I do now because somehow it applies, takes everything that I've done up until now and adds so many things that are fun and a nice intellectual challenge every day. And I'm so happy to have found this field.
Yeah, interesting. So there's quite a few people who've come into conversation design from like film and TV and playwriting and and stuff like that, which is really, I can totally see the parallels. And so you spent a lot of time working with voice, animation, voiceover, stuff like that. And you alluded that it gives you some internal rules, if you like. What might some of those rules be that for someone who maybe is a chatbot designer or someone who is only maybe has even recently picked up kind of generative AI and all that kind of stuff, and maybe they're more newer to this kind of thing. What are some of those things that you've learned from your time in doing voiceovers and putting speech to video that you can apply in the creation of voice user interfaces?
Two big ones, I think, and they're very closely related. One term that came up a lot, because I did dabble in screenwriting too, professional screenwriting very briefly, uh, was something called not allowing something called a block. Basically, reviewing every line of dialogue that you create or position now, I guess you'd say, with LLM voice design, making sure that it's not going to inhibit the conversation, making sure that you haven't accidentally put a dead end um, into the conversation. You basically want to leave the opportunity wide open for the voice agent's conversational partner, the human being, to say something next. And I think people who are into conversation design will recognize that as just very fluidly building conversational turns and adding in all those indicators of what's expected next. So the conversational partners don't have to think very hard about what they're supposed to do in the interaction, and there's no obstacles to them doing what they want to do if that's a little bit perhaps unexpected, or it's wide open, like if we've given the opportunity to express an intent. So and the second thing is very, very closely related to that. I'm not a performer, but you do pick up a lot of things from the improv theater world, especially in recording voice, working with a lot of performers who do come from that world. And that's the concept of yes and, which I think is probably pretty familiar to a lot of people who have heard of have enjoyed improv comedy at all. But yes and is basically that. It's another way of thinking about that, not leaving blocks in the conversation and setting up the next turn for success. Uh, Basically being congenial and agreeing whenever possible, and setting up the next turn. Like, yes, I can take that for you. Just let me get some identifying information for you, and we'll get you verified. That's a pretty good example from voice agents of acknowledging positively and setting up the next step. So yes, and is something that I think about quite a bit. And there's the more advanced level no but. That's for extremely advanced level improvisers, I'm told. But unfortunately, that does come into play in conversation design as well, because things don't always go to plan, and we don't always have good news. So internalizing those two rules, I think, is really good for designing a great conversation.
That's a great idea. I think it touches on some things that I think when people build with LLMs on their own and they don't have any other kind of technologies around it to do things like manage the context of the conversation and the state of the conversation and stuff like that, is that often the responses from a large language model, and I've mentioned this a number of times in the past, often the responses end with a full stop. And so they don't always invite the next turn of the conversation, because they treat the input basically like a question, and then the output they treat like an answer, rather than having a framework of a conversation which is intended to continue the conversation to an end result, if that makes sense. It's kind of a little bit like what you were kind of alluding to there, always having that turn-taking approach. I think for conversation designers, they take that for granted and it's obvious. But I think for a lot of people who are just starting to pick up generative AI today, they don't know about turn-taking, and they don't think about conversation design. They don't think about structuring a conversation to end with a positive outcome for the user. It's mostly thinking about, how do we build this thing with this technology that works, type of thing,
Right. And you've really hit the nail on the head. And I think I'm very lucky, because at this point in LLM Grace 2.0, I've internalized how Grace works to not do that. And I've incorporated it into my approach to conversation design, because you do not want generative dialogue just to bring things to a screeching halt. And what I'm lucky is that conversations I design, I have the luxury of knowing that won't happen if I do my job. And there's two reasons for that. We don't permit Grace to just completely at her will, or at the will of the LLMs rather, generate dialogue. Under most circumstances, we can toggle up her conversationality, in which case, like within certain contexts, she will be more verbose and more chatty, and acknowledge more things, more extraneous information that the user inputs. But we don't let her just chat by herself. So how do we keep how do we keep the generated dialogue from bringing things to a halt is in Grace's knowledge base, where she is allowed to pull from information that is pre-designated as clean, relevant, up to branding standards, compliant with all legal concerns. We will structure the language that's in there, structure the information so that it's not a dead end. Q&A pairs are very good, basically building an FAQ in Grace's knowledge base and writing the answers that we provide, that we give Grace to be able to pull when necessary, making sure they're written in a very conversational tone, still very factual, but that could slot into a conversation whenever they're needed. Like whenever a user has a conversation slightly outside the bounds of the happy path of the conversation, when Grace goes to retrieve that answer from her knowledge base, it will slot into the conversation fluidly. And the second thing is, I've internalized basically Grace's rules for getting the conversation back on track. So when Grace does pull from the knowledge base, she will return to the same point in the conversation that was unfulfilled, go back to the turn that she was attempting to complete before pulling from the knowledge base. So I can rely on Grace to get the conversation back on track after taking that quick sidetrack to pull additional information. And if there's anything I don't like about in testing or in looking at calls with real people, if there's anything I don't like about how Grace phrased that return to the conversation from the brief step outside of it, I can provide coaching. I can give her examples of how she could a little more fluidly resume the conversation and made it a more pleasant and productive experience for everyone else. So maybe a short way of summarizing all that is, I don't advocate for giving LLMs complete free reign or even all that much freedom, period, within a conversation that's task-oriented, because you really don't know where it will end up. So LLMs that are operated within a very clearly defined context and are given really good information from the knowledge base to pull from, that's the key to success. And that's the key to making a conversation that's extremely human, and as we would expect, doesn't require any additional thought about how to navigate through the interface.
Very good point. The what you alluded to just there, where Grace will essentially diverge from a conversation where needed to answer a question, but then return to the right context to resume the conversation from there. That's an example of something that, you might call kind of like a primary skill for a voice agent or for any kind of chat bot or AI agent, is the ability to be able to manage the conversation regardless of what the topic is about, regardless of what the journey is. An AI agent, an AI assistant, whatever you want to call it, a chatbot, a voice assistant, has to have the skills to manage the conversation. That's part of it. Someone asks a question that's not really relevant for this turn, but you can go and answer the question and return back to where you were. Other parts of it are things like, on the voice channel especially, someone might say, hold on a second. And now you've got to build in something that allows them to just pause for a while and then resume the conversation later. In the chat channel, nobody ever really says, can you repeat that? In the voice channel, there's all kinds of different ways that you can say, can you repeat that? What did you say? Say it again. And so there's all these things that like a voice agent has to be able to do as a fundamental primary skill set before you consider what the requirements of the use case are. And most of the time, most platforms need you to basically build all of that stuff in, because no platform really comes with all of this stuff already configured. It's like blank canvas, new use case. We've got to think about at every turn in the conversation, what if the user asks for help? What if the user wants to go back? What if the user wants to start again? What if they want to pause? And it ends up becoming this kind of unwieldy task every single time you create a new voice assistant, depending on the platform you're using. I'm wondering whether Gridspace and yourself in your experience have any ways of mitigating that. Is it the same for you at Gridspace? Is you've got to essentially, every time you've got a new use case, you have to kind of build in these primary skills first? Or have you figured out a way of almost standardizing some of this stuff to be able to get up and running faster and focus on the use case specific stuff rather than that kind of like primary skill stuff that you need to have?
I think the latter, if I remember right. Grace's abilities are out of the box. Like Grace as a platform built on top of a platform is ready to be assigned a job. And Grace as, kind of as a persona or as this this agent who's doing dozens or hundreds of concurrent jobs around the globe, can be assigned and to any job and doesn't sleep, is ready to perform. She just needs to be told, okay, what's the job that you're doing, that she's doing today. Um, and the other thing you mentioned, I think, is perhaps my favorite thing about how the experience of building bots has changed in the LLM era. I mentioned knowledge bases earlier, and that's all well and good. That's really, really helpful. But maybe I'm selfish to say that not having to author voice agents for all the error recovery or conversational repair like we would have to in old either purely NLU or entirely rule-based systems, you might say. That's the big improvement. So Grace being able to auto-correct because her LLMs permit her to understand, like you said, all those ways of asking for more time or asking for her to repeat something, not having to author those is just opened so many doors. You can get a Grace out who's functional in minutes. If you want to write a really quick bot, you can just do it and count on Grace to be able to course correct because of her LLMs. She'll understand what's going on and she'll understand how to resume the task. And back in the old rule-based systems, when I was, authoring out, like longhand, basically writing out solutions for conversational repair, trying to anticipate the most likely way that things could go wrong at any juncture in the conversation, still had to swallow the bitter pill and accept that I was never ever going to be able to write even a significant fraction of all the error recovery to make the system really robust at any given point. Just how much time did I have to author for error recovery, and how much could I think of? Basically, what did that add up to? And knowing that, like you said, trying to break bots earlier, someone just coming in their house, calling for customer service and getting routed to Grace would unknowingly find a million ways to break a bot without perhaps even realizing that they were talking not to a human yet. So Grace's native abilities just to do conversational repair are such a joy to me, but the downstream, like the benefit for people who talk to Grace is also there because most people don't want to break the bot. Sure, you get some people who gleefully want to create mischief, but most people who are talking to Grace just want support or customer service or patient care. Like they want to achieve their goal. And knowing that we can get there because Grace can, if the boat rocks, Grace can steady it out again. Thanks to LLMs. That's been like a night and day difference and makes me love my job even more, frankly.
Yeah. I mean, you used to have to say, those like escalating paraphrase type of things where someone doesn't say something you understand and you got one chance to go back to them and then it happens again, you got another chance, and then it's all just kind of like you end up basically writing very similar versions of the same thing for every single one of those, whereas with a large language model you can contextualize what's just been said, bring that back into the response. I'm sorry, but we don't have, you can't get your chicken insured onto your car, but we can insure other things like this, and this. It's kind of like the ability to just deal with that breadth of language is there, isn't it?
Oh yeah. The example that I usually go to is I'm amazed at how robust, thanks to LLMs, Grace has been to regional Americanisms. And the one that I always use, I don't know how familiar this be, unless maybe you watch Fargo, is "Oh you betcha." That's the example that comes to mind the most. It's like, if you're not deeply familiar with like regional American dialects, like "Oh you betcha" might not be clear, but Grace is able to capture things like that. Whereas in previous NLU-based systems, I would have had to think, okay, like where is this contact center where Grace is going to be deployed based? Are they going to be getting a lot of calls for that use a particular dialect because the customers are in like a 50-mile radius around the contact center? And long form write out all those little Americanisms to try to nudge Grace towards recognizing like things that are very like clear expressions of yes or no, if you're a human being, but need to be defined kind of in a dictionary if you're a robot. And not having to do that now just because, the corpus of language that informs Grace's models is so broad and so deep and so unique. That's been a real treat.
So does that mean then that Grace is using large language models as a primary way of classifying intents then?
Yeah, I know. I mean, yes, I know the kind of like the notion of intents seems to have kind of fallen out of favor perhaps in the last year or two in conversational design community, but I still don't know a better way of expressing what's going on. Like our voice agents will still ask people what it is they want to achieve in a lot of use cases. I mean, some don't, some are laser focused on achieving a single thing, but what we might call a front desk bot will still offer people the opportunity to say which of 3 to a dozen things they're there to achieve that day. Well, that's still intent recognition, but yes, the mechanisms are a little different for setting up the conversations to branch the conversation based on intents these days. But the fundamentals are still the same. And yeah, the LLM is recognizing from people's often rambling, unrehearsed, off the cuff expressions of what they want to achieve those days. It's still very safe to call that intent classification, I think.
Yeah, because at any point in time, you still need to understand what it is that someone, wants to do, and then during the course of doing that thing, they have a question that needs to be answered or whatever. So you still need to have you still need to have understanding of what's being said, don't you? And so that's kind of what I would maybe class as an intent rather than, a bucket of predefined trained examples type of thing. The assistant still needs to kind of understand what it is that someone's wanting to do type of thing,
Yeah, and then the nice thing is, another new advancement is that should we review a conversation, either there was antagonistic testing before putting a bot into production, or maybe a conversation with a real customer human being that needs to have quality assurance run on it. If Grace struggled to recognize an intent the first time because of it was highly colloquial or not so clear in its expression, we can correct that intent recognition post facto, and that particular voice agent will learn that, will internalize it, and within maybe 90 seconds, we'll be ready to start recognizing that expression of intent on later calls. And I think there's kind of a waterfall effect. The more examples that you give Grace, the way someone could express one thing, I think the benefit to all intent recognition within a use case is improved just by giving examples of, like, okay, here's what you should have done, because buried deep within this 3-sentence rant is two words that express exactly what they want to do. And next time search for that. And that then informs all intent recognition. So I couldn't have done that before. Would at best been able to like add maybe some, like dictionary terms that hinted at what someone may have been trying to express in their long ramble. But now being able to correct Grace and make her smarter for the next time that's really fun too.
Yeah. And how do you approach now then the whole concept of design? Has anything changed from that perspective? So before it was, as you mentioned, we have to understand what the intents are. We then have to, when we know what someone's intent is and we get them into a journey, we then need to map out what that journey looks like. These are the sequences that are going to happen in this conversation. Here's some likely things that might go wrong at each turn, and kind of like map out that sort of journey. And then you would sort of like translate that into the tool of choice. And then you're into the dialogue management and state management and testing and all that kind of refinement. Has anything changed now with Grace, given that she's utilizing large language models to do some of this kind of stuff? What's your general sort of approach to designing a voice UX experience?
Well, there is a major way that I've increasingly learned that my approach to these has changed. But first, I do want to say that not like more experiences that are more bot experiences that are laser focused on achieving one thing rather than offering, a menu implicitly offering a menu of intents are really gaining popularity these days. For example, the category I call lead qualification is
Mm-hmm.
that like someone expressed somewhere outside of Grace that they're interested in becoming a customer, hearing more about a product, enrolling in a service, usually a web form, and then Grace follows up. That kind of experience is becoming much more common as businesses around the world are realizing what customer needs they can service that they didn't have the resources, either hours in the day or human power to provide those services. So people are catching on to really unique ways that are kind of single task oriented that Grace can provide a huge business benefit. So that's an increasing share of the kind of experiences that I either design or coach people on designing. But whether I'm designing something that's kind of single track focused on one specific task, or is, like I said, a front desk Grace where kind of the user's oyster, and they can go down many, many different paths. The biggest thing that I've learned uh, is to punt as much as I can to the knowledge base. And that's really nice. I think I spoke to this at Unparsed One last summer, but the technique, as I call it, is under specification. I script a lot less dialogue for Grace because in designing a voice agent experience, there's necessarily some things that you want the bot to express verbatim. And that's true of, human contact center agents too. Anyone who answers a phone, very, very common to be given a script, a choose your own adventure style plot to handle anything that comes up, but still has certain verbal signifiers that you need to hit, certain declarations, perhaps even legal disclosures that have to be read verbatim. So I'm kind of just these days doing the bare minimum of prescribing Grace dialogue and only writing out the things that absolutely have to be there. And leaving any questions or leaving any information that's implied by the things that I do script, or any like elephant in the room style questions, moving those into the knowledge base. So I'm giving Grace the ability to anticipate people's questions about questions like, why do you need that information? Or what's this going to be used for? Or can I provide a different means of identifying myself? Those kind of counter questions people have as they're negotiating through a conversation. I'll put that in the knowledge base rather than kind of adding verbal signposts up front where Grace has to really in-depth explain, or formerly had to really in-depth explain what the next conversational turn, pair, or triplet of conversational turns we're going to try to achieve. And that makes a much more elegant process, but it also, for the people who are either very rapid adopters of speaking to these newly empowered voice agents, or are just power users of tech in general, or perhaps they call this one company where Grace is deployed all the time and this experience is not new to them. They don't have to hear a lot of extra verbiage that may or may not be skippable based on how the voice agent was designed. So, but at the same time, anticipating that a lot, like at least 50% of users, are going to have very justified and valid questions or additional needs for additional information at a minimum about the conversation. Just dump that to the knowledge base, rely that Grace will pull it up if it's needed, and the actual parts of the conversation that I do prescribe out, basically specking the bounds of the job that Grace is there to do. Much more streamlined, simple, uh, doesn't take extra time. That's a beautiful one. People get to their goal faster, or Grace achieves her objective faster. So that's kind of like where I start now, which I could not do in the past, is like, what's the core of this conversation? Okay, boom, we've mapped that out. Let's go into the knowledge base and build out this rich tapestry of everything that Grace might also need to say, that we won't burden the average user with, but can be pulled on endlessly should the need arise. And I think that kind of experience will be familiar to anyone who's designed conversations in any modality in the past. But it was kind of very eye-opening to me as soon as I started designing LLM powered bots, how much I didn't have to do anymore, and all the things I felt guilty about putting into conversations before, because I'm like, oh, this is going to bore so many people, but it's pretty important to at least 50 to 90% of the users. It has to be there. Not having to do that anymore, such a relief. And man, I hope there are people out there who have spoken to old generation voice agents and are speaking to new generation Grace now and have realized that the experience is going so much better these days because they don't have to listen to junk that's remedial for them anymore.
But wouldn't you have handled that anyway? Like, surely that's a, if you look at the typical kind of Grice's maxims and stuff like that, and you look at the quantity kind of maxim, which is only give the right amount of information that's needed for that particular piece of the conversation. And so it's that concept of hiding the stuff that's less relevant, only putting what's absolutely relevant front and center, and then you have an expandable sequence which will go into the more detail if people ask for it. Could you not do that with intents?
So that's true. Only provide what you needed. Just the problem was in older style systems that's resolved now is that to make make a universally or as accessible as possible an experience that could help the largest number of people, you really had to put in a lot of information. It's very easy to insert the conversation designer's own bias about what sufficient information is, and not provide enough information, at least under old style systems. So the tendency was there to make a really useful bot. You'd have to kind of over include information, really spell out step by step what was expected in the conversation or what was needed in order to facilitate the right exchange of data. Because like in business logic, you have to get things right, especially in things like verifying someone's identity. So to make something that could help the largest number of people, really had to put a lot of information into old pre-LLM style voice agents. Think like, okay, I'm a conversation designer here using a computer, doing a career that didn't exist 10 years ago. Like, I understand how to interact with bots, but like, what if my grandparents call in? What if one of my older relatives who doesn't even have a computer in their house talks to Grace? Like, I'm going to need to say a lot more. So that was the reality. You really did have to provide provide just the information that's needed, but really consider like, well, what is needed? It turns out to help like any American who calls in, just to cover our bases, like we need to include a lot of information. So it's nice now that like we still do provide that information. It's there, but not everyone has to listen to it now. Basically, on demand, people can get the conversational experience or get the depth of information that they need as long as they feel comfortable asking for it.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I'm just struggling to understand what's changed there, because aside from an individual person deciding what the response should be, is that what you're saying there? Is that rather than it being a conversation designer deciding what the response should be, and therefore it's their decision to include everything in that response, that now, because all of the responses are put into a knowledge base, that depending on what the user says, Grace decides how much information to pull back? Is that what we're saying?
It's the user that decides. If the user feels underinformed about a conversation and feels empowered to ask Grace questions, then Grace will provide exactly the information they need. And this, maybe to make it more clear, like in old purely rules-based systems, like we'd have to do really annoying things to be accessible. Well, I shouldn't say annoying, but really tedious or detail-oriented things, like for data hygiene, like voice agents would have to express like, okay, this, I'm going to ask you for this one piece of information. And remember, this is the format that this information typically comes in, or, some qualifier like that, which is not good because, that's a little bit IVR-y. No disrespect to my professional peers who designed previous generation IVRs. They did great work. But it's also it's just not conversational, or it's not human conversational. Um, Basically, the pattern of being able to pull from the knowledge base of the human conversational patterns that we're able to more closely match now is that I find that human agents or humans on the phone will ask you questions and be prepared to provide more detail if you get confused. They won't kind of talk down to your intelligence uh, by providing a lot of unnecessary instruction up front, which really was necessary a lot of the time in old rule-based systems. So
But
it's kind of like
is that because though the old rule based systems it was harder to understand what those follow up questions were going to be, and therefore harder to build the model to serve them. I'm trying to understand whether it's a design decision, which is in the old rule based way, designers, as a designer, we choose to put all of that information up front so that people don't have to ask follow up questions, or whether it's that the technology that existed made it so difficult to create those expandable sequences that it was just easier to put it all up front, type of thing. Does that make sense?
yes, yeah. So kind of a combination of that. It was difficult or just very time consuming and basically an infinite amount of work that you couldn't possibly finish to design out all the branching to get a conversation back on track if someone had counter questions about what they're supposed to do when Grace asked them to do something.
Mm.
But also like equally troublesome was just rule-based systems ability to identify um, what to do next and how to get back on track if someone's difficulty with the conversation was like slightly off the script that we were listening for to try to correct. So it is that combination of things. We still can anticipate information that people are likely to need if they ask for it, but we also can have faith and grace to be able to pull exactly what's needed and get the conversation back on track. So we don't have to front load interactions with expectations anymore. Grace doesn't have to subtly explain how to talk to her anymore, which is always the goal. We want to be a truly conversational system. She can just help meet people where they are, because we give people grace this information that she can pull from selectively when she needs it. She can just pull the conversation up to the level of information that any user needs, kind of like a more bespoke conversational experience. But the baseline conversational experience is very streamlined, doesn't burden people down with information that they might find redundant, or the things that they just didn't think they needed explained to them.
How do you deal with latency? Because obviously with large language models, I don't know if you're using large language models or small language models, but that's one of the challenges of large language models, specifically when it comes to voice, is that if you've got to throw a query to something like OpenAI, then you're dealing with the inference time, which can be quite long. And on a voice channel, obviously, anything over 300 milliseconds is kind of deemed to be starting to get to the point where it starts to feel like an unnatural conversation sort of thing. So how do you deal with latency at Gridspace?
Approach one that's the kind of the native Grace behavior is the disfluencies or back channels, the mm-hms, or filler words like, okay, just a sec, let me see, that Grace will kind of, on a randomized pattern, mix and match which filler she inserts into a conversation to cover latency, just like humans do, just like I did just now. So Grace being able to insert something, just conversational filler, lightweight fluff that indicates she's still there and still thinking, is how we approach that day to day. And there's a lot of LLM magic going on from my engineering colleagues there that I don't understand, but I, reap the benefits of knowing that Grace just won't go silent for a few seconds while she thinks about something or retrieves the right information is nice. And I think the other half that takes input from the conversation designer is knowing the moments when we're building out a conversation where Grace is going to do some data task, which may not even be like LLM retrieval. Grace may be pinging an external data source, just like a database, to like look up a customer's account information, or look up the tracking status of a shipment that's en route to someone. Adding in those conversational markers where Grace will actually proactively announce, I'm going to go look up this information for you. It may take me a second. Just hang on. That's the other half of the battle. That's still very necessary. Doesn't come up in like every interaction we build out, but sometimes Grace does have to integrate with a very elaborate like CRM system and go hunting around for information that belongs to the user that's talking to her, but needs to be pulled from some dusty corner of the software library, so to speak. So just knowing when like, oh, maybe through no fault of Grace's, it's going to take a while to find that information. Just having Grace proactively announce that she needs a moment or two.
Yeah.
And also knowing, like, back to having faith in Grace, knowing that like if for some reason we're talking like 2 to 3 seconds to find this information, that's long enough for a human being to get impatient, especially when the conversation isn't going at a good clip before that. So having faith that Grace can kind of multitask and say, oh yeah, I'm still here. Looking for that piece of information. And then probably like right after that, jumping back in and saying, okay, I found it.
Yeah.
Having faith in Grace's ability to just respond automatically via LLM magic, that she's still there and still working, is maybe the third approach to dealing with latency.
That's great. That's really good. That's going back to those primary skills, isn't it? The primary conversation skills, which is, being able to just have the conversation. Hold on a minute, let me just go and check that. As a designer within the Gridspace platform, do you have any degree of control over those things, over those messages, over when they occur and stuff like that? Or is it all just built into the system that if you're doing an API call, it queues up those responses and stuff like that? Or do you have any influence over that as a designer?
A bit of both. And because we want Grace to be available to, first-time conversation designers who, as long as, they just watch one tutorial video, can build out a Grace in minutes, a lot of that behavior is native to Grace and inalterable. Over time, as we see like the success or failure of particular amounts of disfluencies, or maybe disfluencies not being quite the right tone in the moment, my engineering colleagues will like continue to make improvements to basically the decisions Grace makes about what disfluencies and when to insert. So it just gets better over time, and it's native to Grace. But we do also have the ability on any Grace voice agent to toggle her personality. We have something called personality sliders, where they're basically set at 0 to begin with. We call like every personality slider set at 0 as default Grace. And default Grace is exactly who we want her to be, the warm persona that she is, as informed by the data that went into training her models. But we can also toggle up things like her verbosity. If it's on brand for someone to have a more chatty Grace, perhaps they have a culture of very chatty contact center agents, and they want Grace to slide into that nicely, we could have Grace be more florid in her dialogue, or we can really dial up Grace's empathy, which is very nice when Grace is deployed for use cases where a lot of bad news is exchanged, or even good news. We could have Grace be more empathetic to someone filing a life insurance claim as she is to someone saying they need to add their new spouse on their account. So toggling up the empathy kind of necessarily also increases the verbosity, because Grace is permitted to have more of an emotional response. And that does have an impact on, kind of Grace's filler dialogue. Not necessarily on saying like, okay, Grace, insert more disfluencies in the moments where you need a second to think about something, but definitely influencing her conversational partner's perception of what the normal conversation is, and kind of establishing a sense of tone or pace. So if some aspect of Grace's verbosity, which basically like informs, um, permits more freedom to her language generation model, then people might people might just have a different sense of patience for the conversation, uh, because those disfluencies kind of fit in more to a Grace that's more open and less laser focused on achieving a task,
Right.
which is very desirable a lot of the time. You want a Grace that says as little as possible, but that can make the moments when Grace is doing something and not actively speaking more noticeable. So, toggling up the conversation in various different ways can make it seem very, very natural that Grace needs a moment. Just because, really, just what does that achieve? That makes her more human. Talk to a contact center agent or anyone who does phone-based customer service, especially maybe at the end of their shift. The conversation won't be laser focused. There will be chit chat, or there might be a little bit of lag because someone really wants to go home and make dinner or something like that.
Nice. I've got another question about the personality kind of empathy toggles, but just going back to that whole latency thing, I wanted to get your thoughts on this, because this is some people love this. I won't tell you my opinions on it just yet because I want to hear your opinions. In that filler space, Grace will kind of, say, hold on a second, let me just go and look that up, or it won't be a minute. Others have used things like music, little light bits of music, like that. Or others have also used like keyboard sounds, Where do you stand on those tactics?
Against, maybe not out of any like particular dislike necessarily for those methods, but because like I'm kind of a human conversational purist. My goal, and fortunately the goal of I think of everyone I work with, we're very tightly aligned on this, is the more purely human conversational we can make Grace, basically the less distinguishable we can make her from your average contact center agent or just any human being who answers the phone, the better. Not trying to deceive anyone. We definitely have Grace disclose in every interaction that she is non-human, because that's the right thing to do. But the more any like even marginal gains we can make on making Grace less obviously a synthetic interface and seemingly more just a purely human to human interaction or substitute for that, the better. So it's just kind of counter to our goals and my goals to insert artificial non-speech filler there, just because we're kind of obsessive nerds here about really making great speech experiences with no non-speech embellishments. Like we're speech purists, and we want Grace to be able to speak fluently with people, as not just on like a word choice level, but on a complete, holistic conversational level.
I agree. As someone who made music for a long time and is, ex sound designer, and I love that's why I was so interested in Alexa, because it's this device that's audio only, it's voice with its interface, but you can have so much fun with what that interaction looks like. If you were going to do something like let's call it a postage, you want to check how much it's going to be to send something via FedEx, then the beginning of that skill, it would be great to have like a knock at the door or a FedEx van pull up and the sound of a post room, or you can have a load of fun with audio to make the experience really immersive. And in the Alexa world, that kind of worked really well. You know, you would be able to create soundscapes, you would have music, you would then have the voice on there, and it was a lot more engaging. Trying to do this similar sort of thing in the contact center just doesn't seem, the audio signals, the quality is terrible. It doesn't sound the same at all. It's not what people expect. It's not aligned to people's mental model. And so when I hear the type in and the little bits of music and stuff like that, it does feel more synthetic, and it feels a little bit more like this is obviously not a human. It's got kind of like signals back to the old kind of IVR sort of things. I know what people are trying to do. It's an audio channel, so why can't we use audio to our advantage? But I've kind of got to a place where I think I agree with you, which is that it's a conversation and you don't need to have superfluous detail in that conversation. You should really just be focusing on the conversation.
That's true. And massive respect to all my professional peers and fellow unparsed attendees who do work in, I guess, what we call the smart speaker space, or the ambient computing space, if you want to get super nerdy about it. That's awesome. And personally, I'm an advocate for like really doing experimental stuff in that space. I'm not sure that I call it a different modality, because it also is it is the voice channel, but maybe a different flavor of the modality of voice. I'm like, yeah, go nuts. Try different stuff with sound design. Swing for the fences, especially if people have the opportunity to toggle like, okay, I don't like that sound, or that's too much. Can we dial it back a bit, Alexa, for example? I think that's cool. An experiment should be done. It's just I and my colleagues are just working in, like a very rarefied, unique slice of pure voice as a modality, which is over the phone customer service or patient care. Those two broadly, and just the needs are different. It'd just be like in probably 99 out of 100 use cases that I consult on or design myself every day, like any sound design would probably be extremely unprofessional. So beyond just our like focus on making really, really great conversational experiences, just like the context isn't there for adding any embellishments. That's how it is. So, it's like I've always been a fan of working within. I take joy in working within the constraints of an art form. When we think about certain forms of poetry as an example, some of the joy is in finding creative ways to work within the rules, and that's what we're doing with pure customer service oriented voice. And I don't think it diminishes the modality at all, but there's just a very clear separation between types of voice experiences and what non-voice content, or how much non-voice content you could allow. And I just happen to be in a space where the amount is zero. But I do really enjoy working, with voice assistants in other contexts where things can get more creative or experimental.
Yeah, very well put. I was going to ask you a question about the personality, but in the interest of time, and I think you answered quite a bit of that anyway. One final question, which is, where's this stuff going? So we've spoke about how it's changed. It's gone from rule-based stuff, which was less flexible, couldn't really allow you to create the kind of experiences that you want to do, very laborious to manage and maintain, experience for the user is not that great. Now we're into this kind of like large language model, generative AI kind of space where the conversation is more fluid. You're focusing more on creating the substance of the conversation, which is the content that needs to be in there, rather than all of the mechanics around grounding and error recovery and all that kind of stuff. Grace is great. We got plenty of opportunity to have a number of previews of Grace at Unparsed, and I think that the experience is great. The voice sounds really good. All those disfluencies are great. It really sounds natural. What's next? Like, where's this stuff going to next? What are the things coming around the corner that are exciting you?
Well, I think like the immediate thing that's going to happen exactly where we are now is just wider adoption. Um, Again, no offense to anyone, but I think IVRs are very clearly on their way out, and we're just really the reason they're still around is just the inertia, and businesses move slowly and adoption takes time. So kind of laterally, Grace will be Grace and voice agents will be just more present. They'll be deployed a lot more widely very, very soon. And then where I think, regardless of deployment, where I think the technology is heading is just probably greater in the immediate term is probably just greater contextual awareness. That we talk about context window, we're talking about LLMs, and just voice agents that can remember more for longer, do more like conversational flourishes because of that. Recall maybe at the end, be much more capable of like in the sign off of a call and in the closing of a call, refer back to some detail that was dropped, maybe even that wasn't like a slot value or something, information that the agent was seeking specifically, but can reference at the end, like saying, and again, nice talking to you today, and congrats again on your wedding. Hope the honeymoon goes great. So just more autonomy from the agent to pull details from the conversation, use them later in just conversational flourishes. I think that's something really fun that is just getting better and better all the time.
Wicked. That sounds really good. And I look forward to seeing more of that. Maybe is that next year's Unparsed? Maybe you'll be able to show us how that's working. Oh,
no spoilers yet. But yeah, we'll be there.
Nice one. Thank you so much, Cooper. This has been an absolute pleasure. Always a pleasure talking to you. We'll include the links to Gridspace in the show notes. Anything else you want to tell people about? Any other places you want to point them?
Well, directly to Grace. Come talk to Grace. Go to gridspace.com. You can talk to her today. You can actually for free start making your own Grace if you want to play. But yeah, our website's fine, but you can talk to the agent herself. Get in there.
Perfect.
See what she has to say.
That's what we want to do. Like it. Perfect. Cooper, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, my friend.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you again next week. Likely. Might have to move next week, actually, because I've got something going on. But it'll either be next week or the week after. But either way, there'll be another one coming hot on the heels of this. So thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you on